The winter of 1873 brought temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero across the Montana Territory, and while neighboring cabins burned through their entire winter fuel supplies in desperate attempts to stay alive, Tobias Wentland's cabin maintained a steady 74 degrees with a fire barely larger than a cooking flame. What his neighbors had mocked as cave-dwelling foolishness had become the most sophisticated thermal shelter in the region. Before we explore how one man's understanding of stone and heat changed frontier survival, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten innovation move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The elk had been running for nearly 2 miles before it finally collapsed in a narrow canyon Tobias Wentland had never explored. September afternoon light filtered through pine branches as he approached the animal, his rifle still warm from the killing shot. He had been hunting since dawn, pushing deeper into the Montana wilderness than his usual routes took him. The elk had led him into territory he didn't recognize, steep terrain cut with ravines and rock formations that rose suddenly from the forest floor. After field dressing the animal, Tobias looked up and noticed the cliff face. What caught his attention wasn't the height, impressive as it was, but the massive overhang that created a sheltered space beneath. The rock alcove curved back into the cliff at least 30 feet, creating a natural ceiling 15 feet high at its deepest point. The opening faced southeast, protected from prevailing winds by the canyon walls. Tobias approached the alcove slowly, his curiosity overtaking his exhaustion. The floor was dry despite recent rains. Leaves and debris had blown in over years, creating a soft layer of organic matter, but the space itself was clean of the mud and moisture that plagued most ground-level areas in the mountains. He stepped inside and immediately noticed the temperature difference. Outside, the September air carried the chill of approaching autumn. Inside the alcove, the air felt noticeably warmer, almost comfortable. He placed his hand against the rear stone wall. The rock was warm to the touch, still holding heat from the afternoon sun that had angled into the space hours earlier. Tobias stood there for several minutes, his mind working through implications that most men would never have considered. He had spent his youth in Bavaria, apprenticed to his uncle who built bread ovens and small foundries. That work had taught him things about heat, stone, and thermal retention that few frontiersmen understood. The alcove wasn't just shelter from weather, it was a natural heat battery. The massive stone walls absorbed warmth during daylight hours and released it slowly through the night. The overhang prevented heat from escaping upward, while the narrow opening limited cold air infiltration. The geometry created a microclimate, a pocket of stable temperature protected from the extremes outside. Tobias walked the perimeter of the space, examining the rock structure. The stone was solid granite, ancient and stable. There were no signs of cracking or instability. Water stains on the walls showed where rain occasionally reached, but the protected depth of the alcove meant most of the interior remained dry even during storms. The floor was elevated slightly above the canyon floor outside, providing natural drainage. He stood at the opening and looked out at the forest. His homestead claim was 4 miles west on flat ground near the creek, good land for farming with easy access to water. But this alcove represented something different. This was engineering that nature had already completed. All it needed was someone who understood what it offered. Tobias made his decision before he left the canyon that afternoon. He would build here. The settlement meeting took place in Cyrus Pemberton's barn on the first Saturday of October. 23 families had claimed land in the valley over the past 2 years, and monthly gatherings served as government, court, and social hour combined. Tobias waited until the formal business concluded before mentioning his building plans. "I'm constructing my cabin in the North Canyon," he said simply, "inside the rock alcove near Elk Ridge." The room went silent for a moment before Josiah Grimshaw spoke up. "You're building in a cave?" "Under a rock overhang," Tobias clarified. "Natural shelter with superior thermal properties." Finnegan Dooley laughed first, a sharp bark that echoed in the barn. "Superior thermal properties," he says. "Man's planning to live like a bear in a den." Other men joined the laughter. Josiah shook his head with the kind of smile people use when they think someone is making a foolish mistake but trying to be polite about it. "Tobias, you already claimed good flat land by the creek," Alistair Drummond said. "Ground's cleared, water's close. Why give that up for a hole in the rocks? The alcove provides advantages that flat ground cannot," Tobias replied. "Stone walls retain heat. The overhang blocks wind and precipitation. Temperature inside remains stable regardless of external conditions." "Temperature remains stable," Finnegan repeated mockingly. "You mean cold and damp like every cave I've ever seen. You'll be chipping ice off your walls come January." Petra Grimshaw, sitting beside her husband, looked concerned rather than amused. "Will you be safe there, Mr. Wentland, living so isolated in the rocks?" "Safer than in an exposed cabin," Tobias said, "and considerably warmer with less fuel consumption." That statement brought another round of skepticism. Josiah leaned back against the barn wall, arms crossed. "Every man here knows you need a good fire to survive winter. Your little cave's going to be colder than anyone's cabin, and you'll learn that the hard way." Heinrich Bauer, the settlement's blacksmith and trader, studied Tobias with narrowed eyes. "You'll need hardware regardless. Door hinges, brackets, nails. I can supply what you need, though I think you're making a mistake." "I appreciate the business," Tobias said quietly. The meeting moved on to other topics, but Tobias noticed the glances and whispers. By the time he left, the entire settlement had formed their opinion. He was either eccentric or foolish, possibly both. Nils Eklund, a Swedish logger who had spoken little during the meeting, caught up with Tobias outside. "I've worked stone quarries in the old country," Nils said. "Rock holds heat, that's true enough, but I've never heard of anyone building inside stone. We'll be interested to see if your theory works." "It will work," Tobias replied. "Physics doesn't change based on location or opinion." Nils nodded slowly and walked away. Tobias mounted his horse and headed back toward his current shelter, already planning the construction that would prove everyone wrong. Tobias had learned about heat and stone before he learned to read. His uncle's workshop in Bavaria had been built against a hillside, half underground, with massive stone walls that kept the interior cool in summer and surprisingly warm in winter. The bread ovens his uncle constructed used principles that most bakers never thought about consciously. Thick stone walls absorbed heat from the fire, then released it slowly and evenly for hours after the flames died. A properly built stone oven could bake bread 12 hours after the last log burned. Those lessons had seemed abstract during his youth, just part of the work. But after 8 years on the Montana frontier, after 8 winters of burning through cords of firewood to keep inadequate cabins barely habitable, those principles had become survival knowledge. The problem with standard cabin construction wasn't that logs were poor building material. The problem was that logs alone couldn't store heat. Fire warmed the air inside the cabin, but the moment the fire dimmed, that heat escaped through gaps, through the roof, through the very wood itself. Maintaining warmth required constant fire, constant fuel, constant work. Stone was different. Stone had thermal mass. A cubic foot of granite could absorb and store 50 times more heat than a cubic foot of air. Once warmed, stone released that heat over hours, sometimes days. But most frontier builders never thought to use stone beyond chimneys and foundations. They built wooden structures that fought against the cold instead of working with heat's natural properties. Tobias had visited the alcove 6 times since discovering it, always at different times of day. He brought a thermometer purchased from Heinrich Bauer, an expensive instrument that most settlers would consider unnecessary. The measurements confirmed his theory. On a clear September day, when external temperature reached 68 degrees, the alcove interior measured 72 degrees at midday and 70 degrees at midnight. The stone was absorbing solar heat during the day and releasing it at night, creating a buffer against temperature swings. He performed calculations by candlelight in his current shelter. The alcove's rear wall was approximately 30 feet wide and 15 feet high, roughly 450 square feet of granite surface. The stone extended back into the cliff, at least 10 feet, probably more. Conservative estimates suggested over 40,000 cubic feet of stone immediately adjacent to where his cabin would sit. If he could warm even a fraction of that mass with a simple fireplace, the heat storage capacity would dwarf anything a wooden cabin could achieve. The physics were straightforward. Heat moved from warm objects to cold objects until temperatures equalized. In a wooden cabin surrounded by freezing air, heat rushed outward constantly. In a cabin backed by warm stone mass, heat had nowhere to go. The stone would absorb excess heat during the day and return it at night. The overhang would trap warm air that naturally rose. The narrow opening would minimize cold air infiltration while allowing smoke to escape. Tobias sketched designs showing cabin placement within the alcove, calculating optimal distances from walls, planning fireplace location to maximize stone wall warming. The design wasn't complicated, but it required understanding principles that most builders never considered. He wasn't fighting the environment. He was using geology as infrastructure that nature had already constructed. The supply list Tobias compiled was unusual by frontier standards. Most cabin builders needed logs, an axe, perhaps some rope and basic nails. Tobias's list included 60 logs of specific diameter, 80 pounds of square-cut nails, 12 iron brackets, 6 heavy hinges, 20 feet of chain, a specialized draw knife, 2 thermometers, cotton canvas, clay, and horsehair. When he presented the list to Heinrich Bauer, the blacksmith read through it twice before speaking. "You're building a cabin, not a fortress," Heinrich said. "And what do you need 2 thermometers for?" "Measurement," Tobias replied. "One inside, one outside, to document temperature differential." Heinrich shook his head, but began assembling the hardware. "Your money spends same as anyone's, even if you're spending it on foolishness. The brackets and hinges will take 2 weeks to acquire from Fort Benton. Nails I have in stock." While waiting for hardware, Tobias began logging. He needed straight pines between 10 and 14 inches in diameter, and he was selective to the point of obsession. He would examine a tree, measure its diameter at multiple heights, sight along its length to check for twist or bow, then frequently reject it and move to the next candidate. Nils Eklund encountered him during this process and spent an afternoon helping. "In Sweden, we took this much care selecting mast timbers for ships," Nils observed. "For cabins, men usually just cut what's convenient." "Convenient logs create gaps," Tobias said. "Gaps lose heat. I need uniform diameter for tight fitting." They worked together to fell and limb trees, then used Tobias's horse to drag logs to a staging area near the alcove. The work took 3 weeks. By the time Heinrich sent word that the hardware had arrived, Tobias had 62 logs stripped, measured, and ready for construction. He had also made multiple trips to the alcove to clear debris and prepare the building site. The site preparation revealed another advantage of the location. The alcove floor was already level, compressed by centuries of settled debris. Tobias removed the top layer of leaves and organic matter, exposing hard-packed soil and the underlying stone shelf. He marked the cabin perimeter using stakes and string, positioning the structure to place the rear wall within 3 feet of the stone cliff face. That 3-foot gap would serve as a heat circulation channel, allowing warm air to rise behind the cabin and transfer heat to the stone mass. He dug a shallow foundation trench and filled it with rocks gathered from the canyon, creating a level base elevated 4 inches above the alcove floor. The elevation would prevent any water that did enter from pooling under the cabin. He installed drainage channels that sloped toward the alcove opening, ensuring water would run out rather than accumulate. In late October, with materials assembled and site prepared, Tobias began construction. Nils came to help for the first few days, curious enough about the project to donate labor. Together, they set the first logs and established the foundation layout. The cabin would be 14 feet by 18 feet, modest but sufficient. The real innovation wasn't size, but integration with the surrounding stone environment. The foundation platform rose slowly over the first week of November. Unlike standard cabin construction where logs rested directly on ground or minimal stone piers, Tobias built a raised floor system that would isolate the living space from the alcove's stone floor while allowing air circulation beneath. He started with heavy timbers laid parallel across the rock base, spaced 2 feet apart. These support beams were the thickest logs he had cut, 16 inches in diameter and leveled with obsessive precision. Across the support beams, he laid smaller joists at right angles, creating a grid pattern. The joists were notched where they crossed the main beams, creating interlocking joints that prevented shifting. He tested each joist with his full weight before securing it with iron brackets and nails. The result was a platform that felt solid as stone but remained elevated, creating an air gap beneath the cabin floor that would prevent cold transfer from the ground and allow any moisture to evaporate rather than rot the wood. For the actual floor surface, Tobias split thick planks from straight-grained pine. He had purchased a specialized froe tool in Fort Benton specifically for this purpose. The tool allowed him to split planks along the grain rather than sawing them, creating boards that were stronger and less prone to warping. Each plank was shaped with his draw knife until the edges fit together with gaps no wider than 1/8 of an inch. He laid them perpendicular to the joists and nailed them down with the square-cut nails, countersinking each nail head so the floor surface would be smooth. The floor took 8 days to complete. When finished, it sat 6 inches above the alcove's stone floor, level within 1/4 inch across its entire surface. Tobias could walk across it without creaking or flex. More importantly, the air gap beneath would serve as insulation, while the platform's solidity would support the wall weight that came next. Positioning the cabin within the alcove required calculation. Tobias wanted the rear wall close enough to the stone cliff face to benefit from radiant heat reflection, but far enough away to allow air circulation. 3 feet was optimal based on his measurements and understanding of convection patterns. Warm air from his fireplace would rise, flow behind the cabin, warm the stone wall, and circulate back down as it cooled, creating a continuous heat exchange cycle. The side walls needed clearance from the alcove's stone sides for similar reasons, but also to prevent moisture transfer. Stone could weep water during temperature changes, and direct contact would rot logs over time. Tobias planned 18-inch gaps on both sides, enough for airflow and access, but narrow enough to maintain the alcove's thermal advantages. He marked the wall positions on his completed floor platform, snapping chalk lines that would guide the first course of logs. The front wall would sit 8 feet back from the alcove opening, creating a protected porch area while keeping the living space deep within the thermal shelter. Every measurement served multiple purposes: structural integrity, heat retention, moisture management, and long-term durability. Nothing was arbitrary. Everything was calculated. The first log went into place on November 9, 1872. Tobias and Nils lifted it together, settling it onto the floor platform along the chalk line marking the rear wall. The log was 12 inches in diameter, straight as an arrow, stripped of bark and shaped until its surface was smooth. Tobias had notched the ends using a technique he had learned in Bavaria, a modified saddle notch that would interlock with perpendicular logs while maintaining maximum contact surface between horizontal courses. Before placing the second log, Tobias applied his chinking mixture. He had spent 3 days preparing the compound: clay from the creek bank, horsehair acquired from Heinrich Bauer, who collected it from his animals, and pine resin he had boiled down from sap. The mixture had the consistency of thick paste and smelled strongly of pine. He spread it along the top surface of the first log, creating a 1/4-inch layer that would compress when the next log pressed down on it. The second log went perpendicular to the first, forming the side wall. Its notched end fit over the rear wall log, and when Nils and Tobias lowered it into place, the chinking mixture squeezed out slightly, creating a seal. Tobias wiped away the excess and moved to the next log. The process was methodical and time-consuming. Each log had to be positioned, checked for level, adjusted, and secured. The chinking mixture had to be applied evenly. The notches had to align perfectly. By the end of the first day, Only 6 logs were in place, forming the first complete course around the cabin's perimeter. Standard builders could have laid twice that number, but Tobias wasn't interested in speed. He checked each log with his level in multiple locations, adjusted until it was perfect, then moved to the next. Nils watched the precision with something approaching awe. "You're building like a watchmaker," Nils observed. "Most men would have these walls up in 3 days." "Most men's cabins leak heat through gaps you could stick your finger through," Tobias replied. "I'm building for 0 heat loss." The walls rose slowly over the next 3 weeks. Each course of logs was fitted, chinked, and checked before the next course began. Tobias paid particular attention to the rear wall, the one that would face the stone cliff. He applied extra chinking on the rear face of these logs, creating a smooth surface that would maximize heat reflection from the stone behind. The theory was simple. Heat radiating from the cliff face would strike the cabin's rear wall and reflect back into the stone, bouncing between surfaces and gradually warming the entire thermal mass. The front wall, which would face the alcove opening and cold air infiltration, received different treatment. Tobias made this wall thicker by using 14-inch diameter logs instead of 12-inch. The additional 2 inches of wood provided extra insulation against the cold air that would inevitably enter through the door and around the opening. He also planned to pack the gap between logs with additional insulating material once the walls were complete. As the walls reached 4 feet high, Tobias began thinking about openings. He needed a door and at least 1 window, but each opening represented potential heat loss. The door would be positioned in the front wall, offset to one side rather than centered. This placement would create a baffle effect when the door opened, preventing cold air from flowing directly into the living space. The window would be small and positioned high on the side wall, allowing light while minimizing heat escape. The fireplace location was critical to Tobias's entire thermal design. Most cabin builders placed fireplaces on exterior walls for easier chimney construction, but Tobias positioned his in the rear corner, the point closest to the stone cliff face. The placement was deliberate and calculated. Heat from the fireplace would radiate outward in all directions, but the rear wall would reflect a significant portion of that heat back toward the stone cliff. The stone would absorb the reflected heat and store it, creating a thermal battery that would release warmth for hours after the fire died. Building the fireplace required different skills than log work. Tobias had gathered flat stones from the creek bed over several weeks, selecting pieces for their shape and heat resistance. He sorted them by size and thickness, planning their placement before mixing his first batch of mortar. The mortar was a mixture of clay, sand, and lime he had purchased from Heinrich Bauer. Lime was expensive on the frontier, but it created mortar that would withstand high temperatures without crumbling. The firebox itself was small by frontier standards, only 20 inches wide and 18 inches deep. Most settlers built massive fireplaces that could burn 3-foot logs, thinking bigger fires meant more heat. Tobias knew better. Large fireplaces created excessive draft, pulling warm air up the chimney and out of the cabin. They required enormous amounts of fuel and actually reduced heating efficiency. A small, well-designed firebox produced more usable heat with less wood. He built the firebox walls with careful attention to angle. The rear wall slanted forward slightly, designed to reflect heat into the room rather than letting it escape up the chimney. The side walls angled inward as they rose, creating a funnel shape that increased draft efficiency. Every stone was placed to serve both structural and thermal purposes. He used his smallest, flattest stones for the firebox interior, creating smooth surfaces that would radiate heat evenly. Above the firebox, Tobias constructed a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge that prevented downdrafts and reflected heat back into the room. Most frontier fireplaces lacked this feature, which is why they smoked during windstorms. The smoke shelf was simple geometry, but it required understanding how air moved through a chimney system. Cold air trying to descend the chimney would hit the shelf and deflect, while hot smoke would rise past it. The chimney itself was Tobias's cleverest innovation. Instead of building it straight up through the cabin roof, he angled it backward, running it through the 3-foot gap between the cabin's rear wall and the stone cliff. The chimney stones would be heated by the smoke passing through, and that heat would transfer directly to the cliff stone. He was using his chimney as a heat exchanger, warming the thermal mass with waste heat that would normally escape unused. The chimney rose slowly, stone by stone, mortared carefully, and checked for plumb. Where it passed through the gap behind the cabin, Tobias built it with double walls, creating a channel that would contain the smoke while maximizing surface area for heat transfer. The outer surface of the chimney would press against the cliff stone, conducting heat directly into the rock mass. It was engineering that would have impressed his uncle back in Bavaria, using every possible advantage to extract maximum value from the fire's energy. The door became an obsession within the larger obsession. Tobias spent 6 full days constructing what most settlers would build in an afternoon. He started with planks, split from a single pine, selecting wood so dense it barely floated in water. Each plank was 3 inches thick, shaped with his draw knife until the edges were perfectly straight. He cut tongue and groove joints along the edges, a technique he had observed on warehouse doors in Fort Benton. When assembled, the planks interlocked so tightly that light couldn't pass between them. The door measured 6 feet tall and 30 inches wide, deliberately narrow to minimize the opening size. Tobias reinforced the interior face with his iron brackets arranged in an X pattern, bolting them through the planks with square-cut nails that were clinched over on the exterior side. The assembled door weighed nearly 80 pounds, heavy enough that mounting it required Nils's help, but the weight meant thermal mass. The thick wood would resist temperature transfer, acting as insulation rather than just a barrier. The hinges were mortised into both the door and the doorframe logs, set into cut recesses so they sat flush rather than surface-mounted. Tobias used his heaviest iron hinges, each weighing 12 pounds, and bolted them through the logs with iron pins. The door couldn't be torn off without destroying the wall itself. He added a wooden bar lock that dropped into iron brackets, plus a secondary beam lock that slid horizontally through guides and into a mortise cut in the adjacent wall log. The window presented different challenges. Tobias needed light and ventilation, but wanted minimal heat loss. His solution was radical. A window only 8 inches by 12 inches, positioned 6 feet above the floor on the side wall. The small size meant negligible heat escape, while the high placement allowed light to enter without creating a draft at floor level where cold air would settle. He built a thick shutter from reinforced planks, hinged on the interior with a bar lock. Behind the shutter, he stretched his cotton canvas across the opening and embedded it in multiple layers of his clay resin compound, creating a translucent but incredibly strong covering. The roof construction followed similar principles of multiple barriers and thermal retention. Tobias laid thick ridge poles across the top wall logs, spacing them closely at 12-inch intervals. Across these, he placed split planks, each one overlapping like shingles. He pegged every plank to the ridge poles, creating a solid deck. Over the planks went multiple layers of birch bark, waterproof and flexible. Over the bark, he spread his clay mixture in a thick layer. Finally, he laid sod across the entire surface, creating a living roof that would root and provide additional insulation. The cabin was completed on December 3, 1872. Tobias moved his supplies inside and lit his first fire in the small fireplace. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature reached 68 degrees. The stone cliff behind the cabin was already beginning to warm. Tobias hung both thermometers on December 4th, one inside near the door and one outside hanging from a tree branch at the alcove entrance. The external temperature read 34 degrees. Inside, with no fire burning since the previous evening, the cabin measured 56 degrees. He recorded the numbers in a leather-bound journal he had purchased specifically for documentation. Over the following weeks, these measurements would become his evidence. He developed a routine of checking temperatures 4 times daily: dawn, midday, evening, and before sleep. The pattern that emerged confirmed his theories, but exceeded his projections. On December 8th, when external temperature dropped to 18 degrees overnight, the cabin's internal temperature never fell below 52 degrees, despite the fire being reduced to coals. The stone cliff behind the cabin was absorbing heat during the day when he maintained a small fire, then radiating it back through the night. The fire itself was modest compared to what his neighbors burned. Tobias kept a small, steady flame going during waking hours, barely larger than what one would use for cooking. The fire wasn't heating the cabin through direct radiation. It was warming the stone mass, and the stone was heating the cabin. The distinction was crucial. A fire that heated air required constant burning because air didn't store heat. A fire that heated stone could be reduced or even extinguished once the stone reached temperature. By mid-December, Tobias had refined his technique. He burned slightly larger fires during the afternoon when the sun also warmed the alcove, maximizing the heat input to the stone during peak warming hours. At night, he reduced the fire to a minimal level, just enough to maintain some heat input, but primarily relying on the stone's stored thermal energy. The system worked exactly as he had calculated. The cabin remained comfortable while consuming perhaps one-third the firewood a standard cabin required. Nils visited on December 19th and was shocked by the warmth. Outside temperature stood at 22 degrees. Inside, Tobias's thermometer read 69 degrees, and the fire burning in the small fireplace was barely visible, just glowing coals with occasional small flames. "How is this possible?" Nils asked, removing his heavy coat. "My cabin is half this warm even with a fire roaring." Tobias led him outside and around to the gap between the cabin's rear wall and the stone cliff. He placed Nils's hand against the stone surface. The rock was noticeably warm despite the freezing air temperature. "The stone is storing heat," Tobias explained. "All day, heat from my fire warms this rock mass. All night, the rock releases that heat back into the cabin. The stone weighs thousands of tons. Once warmed, it takes days to cool down." Nils ran his hand across the stone surface, feeling the warmth radiating from it. "And your neighbors think you're freezing in a cave. They've noticed my chimney barely smokes," Tobias said. "They assume I'm suffering, but too stubborn to admit failure. Let them think what they want. I'm measuring 70 degrees inside while burning 3 logs per day." Word would eventually spread, but Tobias felt no need to broadcast his success. The measurements in his journal told the story. The comfort of his cabin proved the theory. Winter was just beginning, and he was prepared. January 1873 arrived with temperatures that broke records settlers had been tracking since the valley's first homesteads were established. On January 6th, Tobias's external thermometer registered -12 degrees at dawn. Inside his cabin, the temperature read 64 degrees, with only coals glowing in the fireplace. He added 2 small logs and watched the internal temperature climb to 68 degrees within an hour. His woodpile, which he had estimated would need to last 4 months, was depleting so slowly that he revised his calculations. He would have fuel remaining when spring arrived. His neighbors were not so fortunate. Smoke poured from every chimney in the settlement, thick columns that rose into the frozen air from dawn until late night. Cabins, built on exposed ground, fought against wind that found every gap in construction, every weakness in chinking, every poorly fitted door or window. Families huddled near fireplaces that consumed log after log, struggling to maintain interior temperatures in the 40s and 50s. Josiah Grimshaw burned through half his winter wood supply by mid-January. His cabin, built quickly the previous summer using standard techniques, had seemed adequate during autumn. Winter revealed its inadequacies with brutal clarity. Gaps between logs whistled with wind. The door, hung on simple wooden hinges, had warped slightly and no longer closed tightly. The single window, covered with oiled paper, tore during a storm and had to be covered with a blanket. Despite a fire that burned continuously, the cabin's interior rarely exceeded 50 degrees. Petra Grimshaw mentioned her concerns to other wives during a Sunday gathering at Cyrus Pemberton's cabin. "Josiah says we'll run out of wood before March if we keep burning at this rate, and we're burning everything we have just to keep from freezing." "Everyone's in the same situation," replied Helena Drummond. "Alistair cut wood all summer, more than we thought possible to use, and we're going through it faster than expected." "What about Tobias Wentland?" Petra asked. "His chimney barely smokes. Is he even surviving out there?" The women exchanged glances. The general assumption was that Tobias was suffering privately, too proud or stubborn to admit his cave-dwelling experiment had failed. Some felt sympathy. Others felt he deserved whatever hardship came from ignoring community wisdom. None suspected the truth. Finnegan Dooley was more vocal in his assessment. During a supply trip to Heinrich Bauer's trading post, he mentioned Tobias with obvious satisfaction. "Man built himself into a rock like some kind of animal. Probably freezing to death right now, but won't come asking for help. Pride's going to kill him before winter ends." Heinrich, who had provided the hardware for Tobias's construction, said nothing. He had seen the care Tobias took in selecting materials, the precision in his planning. A man who approached building with that level of detail wasn't a fool, regardless of what others thought. The cold deepened as January progressed. By the 23rd, temperatures dropped to -18 degrees. Tobias's cabin maintained 66 degrees with his small maintenance fire. He sat at his table in the evening, comfortable in a single wool shirt, recording measurements while his neighbors burned fence posts and furniture scraps to supplement depleting firewood supplies. February brought weather that transformed inconvenience into genuine crisis. Temperatures that had seemed extreme in January became the new baseline, with cold snaps pushing the thermometer to -25 and below. Tobias recorded -32 degrees on February 9th, the coldest reading he had documented. Inside his cabin, the temperature stood at 63 degrees, with only his maintenance fire burning. The stone mass behind his cabin had become a heat reservoir so vast that even extreme external cold couldn't deplete it faster than his small fire could replenish it. The settlement faced desperation. Families who had cut what they believed were adequate wood supplies watched those supplies vanish with alarming speed. Alistair Drummond began burning lumber he had intended for spring construction projects. Cyrus Pemberton dismantled an unused shed for fuel. Josiah Grimshaw cut green wood from standing trees, wood that burned poorly and created excessive smoke, but burning it was better than freezing. The Byrne family's situation became critical first. Eamon Byrne had arrived in the valley late, claiming land in August and building his cabin in September. The rushed construction showed its flaws immediately. His wood supply, cut hastily from whatever trees were convenient, had been inadequate from the start. By early February, he was rationing fuel, burning fire only during the coldest hours, and letting it die during the day to conserve wood. Colum Rafferty, Eamon's nearest neighbor 2 miles distant, visited on February 11th and found the Byrne cabin barely warmer than the outside air. Eamon's wife and 3 children wore every piece of clothing they owned, huddled under blankets near a fire that was little more than smoking logs. Colum offered what spare wood he could, perhaps 3 days of fuel, but his own supply was running dangerously low. "We'll make it to spring," Eamon said, though his voice carried no conviction. "Weather has to break eventually." But the weather didn't break. February continued its assault. On February 14th, another cold snap dropped temperatures to -28 degrees. Families slept in shifts, one person awake at all times to maintain fires through the night. Children who had played outside during autumn now remained inside constantly, their parents terrified of frostbite, or worse. The settlement's earlier optimism, the pioneer confidence that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, was being tested against physics that cared nothing for determination. Finnegan Dooley's cabin, despite his earlier mockery of others' struggles, faced its own problems. His fireplace, built quickly without the refinement Tobias had employed, created excessive draft. Heat poured up the chimney almost as fast as the fire produced it. He burned enormous amounts of wood to maintain barely adequate warmth. His wood supply, which should have lasted until April, would be gone by mid-March at current consumption rates. The valley's smoke changed character. Where chimneys had produced steady, clean smoke from dry wood, they now belched thick, irregular smoke from green wood, furniture, and anything else that would burn. The desperation was visible in the air itself, hanging over the settlement like a gray shroud. Colum Rafferty found Eamon Byrne on the morning of February 17th. He had ridden over to check on the family after 2 days without seeing smoke from their chimney. The cabin door was frozen shut, ice having formed where moisture from inside had seeped through gaps. Colum had to use his shoulder to break through. Inside, the temperature was perhaps 10 degrees warmer than outside, meaning it stood somewhere near -15. The fireplace contained only ash. Eamon was in his bed, covered with every blanket the family owned. His wife and children had survived by staying together under their combined blankets, their shared body heat barely enough to prevent freezing. They had burned their last wood 36 hours earlier. Eamon had apparently tried to make it through the night. The cold had simply been too severe. His body had shut down while he slept, the hypothermia taking him without struggle or apparent pain. His wife had known he was dead by dawn, but had been unable to leave the bed where her children needed her warmth to survive. Colum wrapped the family in his own blankets and got them to his cabin, then rode to alert the settlement. By afternoon, a dozen men had gathered at Cyrus Pemberton's cabin, the largest structure and the only one with sufficient space for a community meeting. Eamon's body had been moved there, laid out in the back room where the cold would preserve it until ground thawed enough for burial. The men stood in uncomfortable silence. Death was no stranger to frontier life. Men died from accidents, from disease, from encounters with wildlife or hostile tribes. But this death felt different. Eamon hadn't died from bad luck or unavoidable danger. He had died from cold that everyone was experiencing, in a cabin that everyone knew was inadequate, from a wood shortage that everyone was facing. "Could have been any of us," Alistair Drummond said quietly. "Our cabins aren't that much better than his." Josiah Grimshaw stared at the floor. His own wood supply would last perhaps 3 more weeks at current burn rates, and March could bring weather just as severe as February. "We need to discuss options," he said. "Consolidating families, sharing resources, something." "Won't work," Heinrich Bauer replied. "Putting more people in cold cabins just means more people freezing. The problem isn't population distribution, it's heat loss. These cabins can't hold warmth regardless of how much wood we burn." Finnegan Dooley, unusually subdued, asked the question others were thinking. "What about Wentland? His chimney's been barely smoking all winter. Is he even alive out there?" "Saw him at my trading post 4 days ago," Heinrich said. "Looked healthy, wasn't complaining about cold. Bought coffee and tobacco, nothing emergency." The men exchanged glances. How was Tobias surviving comfortably while the rest of the settlement struggled? The funeral was held the following day, a brief service in weather too cold for extended outdoor ceremony. Eamon was buried in a grave hacked from frozen ground. His family would stay with the Raffertys until spring, when decisions about their future could be made. The cold that arrived on February 23rd made everything previous seem mild. Tobias's external thermometer registered -38 degrees at dawn, -42 by mid-morning. He had never recorded temperatures this extreme, even during his 8 years in Montana. The air itself seemed hostile, attacking any exposed skin with immediate burning sensation. Metal became dangerous to touch. Wood became brittle. Inside his cabin, Tobias maintained 62 degrees. He had increased his fire slightly, adding an extra log every few hours, but the demand remained modest. The stone mass behind his cabin had been absorbing heat for 3 months. That accumulated thermal energy created a buffer against even this extreme cold. He sat at his table, warm enough to work without gloves, recording his measurements and wondering how the settlement was managing. They were not managing. Josiah Grimshaw's cabin, despite a fire that roared constantly and consumed wood at an alarming rate, could not maintain 40 degrees. The family wore every piece of clothing they owned. Petra and the children stayed in bed under piled blankets. Josiah fed the fire continuously, watching his wood supply vanish. By afternoon of the second day of extreme cold, he faced mathematical certainty. His wood would not last another week. The cabin's inadequacies were no longer ignorable. Wind found gaps between logs that Josiah had thought were adequately chinked. The door leaked air around its entire perimeter. The window covering, just oiled canvas, provided almost no insulation. Heat from the fireplace rose to the ceiling and escaped through the roof faster than the fire could produce it. The cabin was a system designed to lose heat, and no amount of fuel could overcome its fundamental flaws. On the evening of February 24th, with external temperature at -39 and his cabin's interior at 38 degrees despite continuous fire, Josiah made a decision. Pride was worthless compared to his family's survival. He told Petra to bundle the children in every blanket they had. "Where are we going?" she asked. "To Tobias Wentland's cabin," Josiah replied. "Something's allowing him to survive comfortably. I don't care if he's using witchcraft or pacts with the devil. Our children aren't freezing to death because I'm too stubborn to ask for help." The journey was only 4 miles but felt infinite. Josiah led his horse with Petra, and the children mounted, wrapped in blankets. The cold was paralyzing. By the time they reached the canyon where Tobias had built, Josiah's face was numb and his hands were losing sensation despite heavy gloves. They found the alcove entrance and stumbled toward the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney, but only a thin stream, barely visible. Josiah expected to find Tobias barely surviving, perhaps willing to share his meager warmth. He knocked on the heavy door, each impact of his fist against the wood painful in the extreme cold. Tobias opened the door after a moment. He wore a single wool shirt and looked comfortable. Warm air poured out from the cabin interior. Josiah stood speechless, his family behind him, staring at a reality that contradicted everything he had believed. Tobias stepped aside without hesitation, gesturing the Grimshaw family inside. Petra entered first, carrying the youngest child, followed by the 2 older children, and finally Josiah. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature difference struck them with physical force. After hours in -40-degree cold, the cabin's warmth felt overwhelming, almost disorienting. Josiah's eyes went immediately to the thermometer, hanging near the door. It read 74 degrees. He stared at the instrument, certain it must be broken or incorrectly calibrated. No cabin could maintain 74 degrees in this weather. It was impossible. "Your thermometer is malfunctioning," Josiah said. "It's accurate," Tobias replied calmly. "I have a second one outside reading -39 degrees. Both instruments were calibrated together. The differential is 113 degrees. Petra had already begun removing blankets from the children, who looked around with wide eyes. The cabin was smaller than their own, but felt immeasurably more comfortable. A small fire burned in the fireplace, barely more than cooking size, yet the warmth was everywhere, surrounding them, solid and reliable. "How?" Josiah asked simply. "We're burning 10 times the wood you are, and our cabin won't stay above 40 degrees. Tobias gestured for them to sit. He had only 2 chairs, so the children sat on his sleeping platform while Petra took 1 chair and Josiah remained standing. Tobias began explaining, starting with the most fundamental principle. "Your cabin loses heat faster than your fire can produce it," he said. "My cabin doesn't lose heat. That's the entire difference." He led Josiah to the rear wall and placed his hand against the logs. The wood was warm to the touch, noticeably warmer than room temperature. Then Tobias took a lantern and led Josiah outside, around to the gap between the cabin and the stone cliff. Even in the brutal cold, the demonstration was clear. The stone face radiated heat, warmth that could be felt standing inches away. "This rock mass weighs thousands of tons," Tobias explained, his breath creating clouds in the frozen air. "Stone has high thermal capacity. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. For 3 months, my fireplace has been warming this stone. The stone stores that heat and radiates it back into my cabin continuously." They returned inside quickly, the cold too severe for extended explanation. Tobias showed Josiah how the chimney ran through the gap behind the cabin, transferring heat to the stone. He explained the 3-foot air circulation space, the multi-layer roof, the thick door, the minimal window. Every element worked together to trap heat inside, while the stone mass acted as a massive battery, storing thermal energy and releasing it steadily. The alcove itself provides wind protection and thermal stability, Tobias continued. But the stone mass is the key. Your cabin sits exposed on flat ground, surrounded by air that's -40 degrees. My cabin sits surrounded by stone that's 60 degrees. Heat flows from warm to cold. In your cabin, heat flows outward into freezing air. In my cabin, there's nowhere for heat to go. The Grimshaw family stayed 3 days while the extreme cold persisted. During that time, Tobias's cabin became an informal classroom. Other families, learning that the Grimshaws had found warm shelter, arrived seeking refuge from the deadly temperatures. Tobias couldn't house everyone, but he could accommodate families during the worst hours and provide the education that might save lives next winter. Alistair Drummond arrived on the second day, bringing his own thermometer to verify Tobias's claims. He hung it beside Tobias's instrument and watched both read 73 degrees while outside temperatures remained near -40. Alistair was an educated man, trained as a surveyor before coming west, and he understood immediately what Tobias had accomplished. "You've created a geothermal system," Alistair said, "using the Earth's thermal mass as a heat battery. This is engineering I've read about in journals but never seen implemented." "It's not complicated," Tobias replied. "Stone holds heat. Large amounts of stone hold large amounts of heat. Position your cabin where stone can absorb and return heat, and you eliminate most fuel requirements." Nils arrived that afternoon with questions about implementation. Could this technique work without a natural alcove? How much stone mass was necessary? What if someone built a cabin against a cliff face without an overhang? Tobias answered each question methodically, explaining that while the alcove provided ideal conditions, any significant stone mass could be utilized. A cabin built against a south-facing cliff would benefit from solar warming plus fire warming. Even stone foundations, if built massively enough, could provide thermal storage. Heinrich Bauer came on the third day, bringing his account books. "I need to know what hardware would be required if others want to build like this. Next winter, I'll have men asking for supplies, and I want to be prepared." The conversations continued through the evening. Families took turns warming themselves in the cabin while Tobias explained thermal mass principles, heat transfer, and the physics of why their current cabins failed. Some listeners grasped the concepts immediately. Others struggled with ideas that contradicted their assumptions about heating and construction. But everyone understood the fundamental reality. Tobias's cabin worked, and their cabins didn't. Josiah, who had arrived skeptical and desperate, became one of the most attentive students. He took notes, asked detailed questions, and began sketching ideas for modifications to his own cabin. "I can't move my cabin or build into stone," he said, "but I could build a stone wall behind it, create thermal mass artificially." "It would help," Tobias confirmed. "Not as effective as natural stone, but better than nothing. You'd need the wall to be thick, at least 3 feet, and you'd need to position your fireplace to warm it." As the extreme cold finally moderated and families returned to their own cabins, word spread through the entire settlement. Tobias Wentland, the man they had mocked for building into a cave, had solved the problem that killed Eamon Byrne and nearly killed others. His understanding of heat and stone had created shelter that transcended anything the settlement had previously imagined possible. The settlement meeting on March 15th had the largest attendance in the valley's history. Every family sent representatives, and the single topic was shelter. Eamon Byrne's death and the near catastrophe of February's extreme cold had eliminated any pretense that current construction methods were adequate. Men who had mocked Tobias 4 months earlier now listened to him with the attention usually reserved for ministers or doctors. Tobias stood at the front of Cyrus Pemberton's barn and explained his methods without embellishment. He described thermal mass, heat retention, and the advantages of building with rather than against natural geology. He showed his journal with 3 months of temperature measurements, documented proof that his cabin maintained comfort with minimal fuel, while conventional cabins struggled despite massive wood consumption. "The question isn't whether this works," Tobias said. "My cabin proves it works. The question is whether similar sites exist and whether you're willing to invest the time to build properly." Alistair Drummond had already begun preliminary surveying. He unrolled maps showing the valley's geography and marked locations where rock formations might provide building opportunities. "There are at least 4 alcoves or significant overhangs within 10 miles, he reported, plus numerous cliff faces that could be utilized even without overhangs. The geology is favorable." Nils raised the practical concern everyone was considering. Building into stone takes time. Tobias spent 3 months on construction. Most men can't invest that much time when they need shelter immediately. "Then build quickly for the first winter and properly for the second," Tobias replied. "A standard cabin will keep you alive if you have sufficient wood. But if you want shelter that doesn't require burning half a forest every winter, invest the time to build with thermal mass." The discussion turned to specific sites. Nils had found a promising alcove 6 miles north, similar to Tobias's location. Lars Bergstrom, a recent arrival who had spent the winter in a temporary shelter, claimed he would build there immediately. Finnegan Dooley, humbled by his own near disaster with fuel depletion, asked about building against the cliff face near his current claim without relocating entirely. "It can work," Tobias confirmed. "You won't have the advantage of an overhang, but a cabin built tight against south-facing stone will still benefit from thermal mass. Your fireplace should be positioned in the rear corner, warming the cliff face. You'll need to seal the cabin better than standard construction to prevent heat loss through gaps." Heinrich Bauer announced he would stock specialized hardware based on Tobias's specifications. Heavy hinges, iron brackets, proper nails, and materials for superior chinking would be available by summer. "I'll order from Fort Benton immediately. Anyone building this summer will have what they need." The meeting concluded with a consensus that surprised even those present. The settlement would adopt alcove building principles as the standard recommendation for new construction. Existing cabins would be modified where possible. The tragedy of Eamon Burns' death would not be repeated if human effort and understanding could prevent it. Summer 1873 brought construction activity unlike anything the valley had previously seen. 3 families began building alcove cabins at sites Alistair Drummond had identified and surveyed. Lars Bergstrom took the northern alcove Nils had found, a formation slightly smaller than Tobias's, but with similar thermal advantages. Finnegan Dooley, having barely survived winter in his inadequate cabin, relocated to a cliff-backed site 2 miles from his original claim. Even Josiah Grimshaw, who couldn't abandon his established farm, began constructing a massive stone wall behind his existing cabin, creating artificial thermal mass that might provide some of the benefits Tobias's natural stone offered. Tobias visited each construction site multiple times, consulting on details that inexperienced builders might overlook. At Lars's alcove, he explained the importance of the air gap between cabin and stone, demonstrating how warm air needed circulation space to transfer heat effectively. At Finnegan's cliff site, he helped position the cabin to maximize southern exposure, ensuring the cliff face would receive maximum solar warming in addition to fireplace heat. The construction technique spread through observation and adaptation. Heinrich Bauer's supply of specialized hardware sold rapidly. Heavy iron hinges, proper brackets, and square-cut nails became standard purchases rather than unusual requests. Men who had built cabins in 4 days the previous year now invested weeks in careful log selection, precise fitting, and superior chinking. The additional time seemed justified after a winter that had killed 1 man and nearly killed others. Nils Eklund, who had helped Tobias from the beginning, built his own alcove cabin in a formation 8 miles west. His experience with Tobias's construction made him the valley's second expert, and other builders sought his advice when Tobias was unavailable. The knowledge was spreading organically, each successful project creating another person who understood the principles and could teach others. By autumn, 5 new alcove cabins stood completed, and 3 more were under construction. Existing cabins had been modified with improved chinking, better doors, and in some cases stone walls built against rear faces to provide thermal mass. The settlement's approach to shelter had transformed completely. What had been mockery in October 1872 had become accepted practice by October 1873. Travelers passing through the valley noticed the unusual construction and asked questions. Some were heading to Oregon or California and took the knowledge with them. Others were prospectors or trappers who would spend winters in remote locations and understood immediately the value of shelters that required minimal fuel. The techniques began appearing in other settlements, sometimes credited to Tobias by name, more often simply adopted as the Montana method or alcove building, without attribution. Tobias neither sought credit nor avoided it. He answered questions when asked, provided advice when requested, and otherwise focused on his own affairs. The validation he needed had come in February when his cabin kept the Grimshaw family alive. Everything after that was simply knowledge spreading to people who needed it, which seemed entirely appropriate. The winter of 1873-74 proved milder than the previous year, but the new alcove cabins demonstrated their worth regardless of weather severity. Families who had struggled through the previous winter now lived in comfort, burning modest amounts of fuel and maintaining consistent interior temperatures. The contrast was so dramatic that several families who had planned to leave the valley in spring decided to stay, confident that proper shelter made the climate survivable. Tobias's cabin became a landmark. Travelers used it as a navigation reference, and new settlers often visited to see the original implementation of alcove building principles. Tobias tolerated the attention without encouraging it, remaining focused on his own survival and modest prosperity. He trapped during appropriate seasons, improved his cabin with minor refinements, and maintained the detailed records that had characterized his approach from the beginning. By 1880, alcove building techniques had spread throughout the northern Rockies. Variations existed based on local geology and available materials, but the core principles remained consistent. Build with thermal mass, minimize heat loss, use stone as a heat battery. Cabins built using these methods lasted longer, required less fuel, and provided superior comfort compared to conventional construction. The technique became standard knowledge among experienced frontier builders. Heinrich Bauer estimated in 1882 that alcove building principles had influenced at least 50 cabins across Montana and Wyoming territories. The actual number was probably higher, as many builders adopted the techniques without formal documentation. Each cabin represented a family that would burn less wood, face less danger from extreme cold, and have better odds of surviving the harsh winters that killed the unprepared. Tobias himself remained in his alcove cabin until 1893, when age and declining health forced him to move to Helena, where medical care was available. He sold his property to a young prospector who recognized the cabin's superior construction and maintained it carefully. The cabin remained occupied through the 1890s, serving various owners who all benefited from Tobias's 2 decades-old engineering. Tobias Wentland died in Helena on March 7, 1896, at age 68. His obituary in the Helena Independent mentioned his years as a trapper and settler, but made no reference to his contributions to frontier construction methods. He was buried in the city cemetery under a simple stone marker bearing his name and dates. But in the mountains, the legacy persisted. His original cabin stood for another 30 years, weathered but structurally sound, the stone behind it still holding heat when fires burned inside. Other alcove cabins scattered across the territory continued sheltering families, their occupants often unaware of the man who had first understood how stone and heat could work together to create shelter that transcended conventional limits. The knowledge had become anonymous, embedded in frontier building practices, passed from builder to builder as simply the way things are done. Tobias had solved a problem that killed people, shared that solution freely, and asked nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing it worked. The stone remembered, holding heat as it always had, silent testimony to what one man's understanding could accomplish.